Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into how the very idea of a battlefield is changing right before our eyes. We're going to explore how a simple line of code can become a weapon, how nuclear threats are evolving in some really startling ways, and what happens when an AI starts advising on the decision to go to war.
So, let's kick things off with a question that feels like it's straight out of a movie, but is actually a critical challenge for global security right now. If one country launches a massive cyber attack that cripples another nation's power grid or financial system, is that an act of war?
To even start to answer that, we've got to understand the language of conflict. You see, in military circles, they make this really important distinction between the digital world and the physical one. A physical attack, one with missiles, bombs, bullets, they call that a kinetic attack. It's real, it's destructive, and it's often deadly.
Okay, but what happens when that clear line between a digital keystroke and a kinetic explosion starts to get, blurry? This is exactly where the modern battlefield gets so incredibly complicated.
For years, the big debate has been whether a conflict that starts online, in cyberspace, could actually spill over into real-world physical violence. The fear has always been that a cyber attack could be so damaging that it provokes a kinetic response, basically escalating a digital fight into an actual shooting war.
So, how often does a digital bullet actually lead to real-world damage? Well, a major study, backed by a NATO center, decided to dig into this exact question. They tried to find a direct, provable link between cyber operations and physical, kinetic attacks.
The research really boiled down to 5 core questions to understand this relationship. Things like, do countries actually launch missiles in retaliation for a hack? Do they treat $1 billion in digital damage the same way they'd treat $1 billion of physical destruction? They were looking for that clear echo from the digital world into the physical one.
So they looked at some huge real-world incidents. In the Russia-Georgia war back in 2008, it looked like cyber attacks did prepare the battlefield for the physical invasion. But then you look at Ukraine, and major cyber attacks like NotPetya actually happened after the shooting had already started, and they didn't really change the course of the war. And the link between Iran's massive 2012 cyber attack on Aramco and a missile strike 7 years later, let's just say it's tenuous at best.
So, what's the big takeaway here? The evidence for a direct link is surprisingly scarce. It's fascinating, right? Despite all the hype and fear, nations seem to treat cyber attacks as something fundamentally different from kinetic ones. There seems to be this threshold, a line between non-lethal cyber operations and lethal physical ones. For now, it seems those two worlds of warfare remain mostly separate.
So, okay, there's a kind of fragile wall between digital and physical conflict. But that is not the only line that's blurring. Now we have to turn to the nuclear shadow, where the distinction between a conventional missile and a nuclear one is becoming dangerously unclear.
A U.S. Congressional Research Service report really lays this out, detailing how Russia's modern nuclear strategy has shifted dramatically since the Soviet era. And we're not talking about old Cold War posturing here. This is a whole new playbook designed for a much more complex world.
You might remember, the Soviet Union famously had a no first-use policy for nuclear weapons. Well, modern Russia, they rejected that. Back in the 90s, faced with a weaker conventional military and an expanding NATO, Russia started to lean much more heavily on its nuclear arsenal, not just to deter a nuclear attack, but to deter a conventional one that could threaten the very existence of the state.
And this wasn't kept secret. President Putin made this stance crystal clear in 2018. The message is pretty unambiguous. A massive conventional attack that threatens Russia could be met with a nuclear response. The line for using a nuke is no longer just another nuke.
Some U.S. analysts have a name for this strategy: escalate to de-escalate. And the theory is kinda chilling. It suggests Russia might use the threat of a limited nuclear strike to basically shock an adversary into backing down from a conventional fight. In effect, winning a smaller war by threatening a much, much bigger one. It's a hugely controversial idea, but it shows you just how blurry that nuclear line has become. I mean, can you imagine making decisions of that magnitude, especially with nuclear weapons in the mix? It's an immense weight for any human commander. And that brings us to our final blurred line. What happens when the advice for these life-and-death decisions comes not from a person, but from an algorithm?
So let's talk about where human decision-making meets artificial intelligence. We're talking about AI-based Decision Support Systems, or DSS. Now, just to be clear, this isn't science fiction about killer robots. These are real systems designed to process incredible amounts of battlefield data, intelligence, surveillance, logistics, you name it, all to help a human commander make a better, faster decision. But this is where it gets really interesting, because these systems introduce a whole host of new challenges. Think about it. There's automation bias. That's the tendency for a commander to just start trusting the machine without question. Then you've got de-skilling. What happens if they forget how to plan for themselves because the AI always does it? And maybe the most worrying is acceleration pressure. This pressure to decide at machine speed, squeezing out that crucial time for human reflection and moral judgment.
And this chart really just lays out the trade-offs perfectly. On one hand, yes, AI promises incredible speed and data processing power, way beyond any human. But on the other hand, it introduces new kinds of bias hidden in the code, and it risks diluting moral responsibility. If an AI gives a flawed recommendation that leads to a tragedy, who's ultimately to blame? The commander? The programmer? The data it was trained on? It gets complicated fast.
And this brings us to the final critical question that really ties all of these threads together: cyber warfare, nuclear deterrence, and artificial intelligence. And that question is, who is really in control?
Because when you step back and look at it, from the cyber operator launching an attack with unclear consequences, to the national leader thinking about a nuclear response to a conventional threat, to the battlefield commander weighing advice from an algorithm, the whole process of choosing to wage war is getting faster, way more complex, and a lot less purely human.
And that leaves us with one last provocative thought. In this new, completely blurred battlefield, we have to ask ourselves, as our technology gets faster and our weapons get smarter, are we, the humans who build and use them, getting any wiser? How do we make sure that human judgment and morality can actually keep pace with the very tools we've created?